quite simple. An X is something that used to be. A spurt is merely a drip under pressure. I got started on this Stow Ferry business all back in '82 when my wife and I thought, what's going to happen to the ferry? Now, some of her ancestors, some of her relatives had worked on the ferry, including her dad. So I called Joe Gerasi, and he said not to worry. He said that some group by the name of Sea Lion Group was taking over. And I said, well, that's one run by Ernie Cowan. He said, yeah. And so I called up my good friend Ernie Cowan and volunteered to be an operator. And the following spring, he had us all take an examination, and we all ran the ferry for, well, volunteers, between volunteers and some paid people, why they're still running the ferry, although it's been having a rough time here lately. Okay, well, let's go back to the ferry itself. Of course, everybody knows the origin of Chautauqua Lake. They all know that up until the last ice age, it was really two valleys, one of which the streams flowed north into Lake Erie, and the other of which the streams flowed south down to the Allegheny River, the way they do now. But the last ice age left a ridge that we know as the snow ridge there, and that blocked off that channel so that the lake filled up and became what we see today. The name Chautauqua, last night I checked over all the different meanings for that name that I have, and I have over 20 of them, but I guess most of us settle on the bag tied in the middle. Although there's a couple of them that are kind of hilarious, but I'm not going to go into that today. Let's talk about the ferry. The first ferry was probably some enterprising Indian that transported people across the Narrows, because not everybody had a canoe in those days. But as far as we're concerned, the first ferry was this log raft that William Wallace Bemus, no, Tom Bemus, I got my people mixed up here. Tom Bemus rowed or poled across the Narrows. Now he got a license to do that on June 25th of 1811. It was the first session of the Court of Common Pleas in Mayville, and it was in a green plank building that was an addition to Scott's Tavern, and the green planks came from Reuben's sawmill, Reuben Slayton's sawmill in Asheville, and they were floated down Goose Creek and then floated up Chautauqua Lake to Mayville. He got this license to keep a ferry. Everybody had a license to keep a ferry over on the Narrows from March 1st until December 1st. It was good for 3 years. He was allowed to charge 6.5 cents for one person, 18 3/4 cents for a horse with rider, and 37 3/4 cents for a wagon or carriage with horses or oxen. People are still trying to figure out where these 3/4 and half all that came for. I have in my possession halfpennies from Great Britain, but I never heard of a 3/4. Well, anyhow. They rowed it or poled it along for a long while, and then somebody got the bright idea. They attached a rope, Bemis to stow, and it passed through rollers on the ferry, and a man would stand in the middle of the ferry and pull it across, and then he'd pull it back. At 1986, there was still a ferry operated exactly this way by some Mexican fellows down across the Rio Grande at Los Ibanos. Of course, this was an arduous task, especially on windy days. Now Thomas Bemus finally died on May 19th of 1828. I'm going to have to cut this down, quit rattling off here. But at any rate, at the same time, a new threat appeared to the ferry, the steamboat. About that time, they built a dam down at Jamestown, approximately where the Warner Dam is now, and this boosted up the level of the outlet so that they could get steamboats up and down it. And the steamboats, of course, with their paddle wheels and their propellers, they would very often cut the manila rope. Now, up until this time, the only thing that had been going up and down the lake were rowboats, canoes, dugouts, rafts, keelboats, or schooners. This business of cutting the rope plagued them until 1897, when steel cable was installed, which they still entangled, and when you did that, why, it was more expensive to repair it. So by now we're up to Alton Ball, who was running the ferry, and Alton complained to the Navigation Commission on the lake, and they issued an order that all the steamboats had to blow their whistle, thank you.
He told me to wink, when he winked, to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They had to blow their whistle as they approached the Narrows, so the ferry could get into one side or the other and release tension on the cable, and then the cable would drop to the bottom. Incidentally, in those days, Stowe was called the Lakeland Flag Stop. Didn't even have a name. I'm still trying to determine when Stowe became Stowe, so if any of you know, please let me know. After he died, a lot of people tried to run it, and one fellow by the name of Philip Strong, he tried a horse on a treadmill. Now, there was a steamer. No, don't laugh. There was a boat in Jamestown called the Twins, and it was horse-driven. A horse on a treadmill drove a paddle wheel that moved this boat through the water. Apparently it didn't work too good, because 3 years later they converted it to steam, and the horse was out of a job. But anyhow, he tried it, but the horse became so frightened by the contraption and the noise that he just stood there and wouldn't move. Well then, another fellow by the name of Albertus Rappole, a name you're probably familiar with, he tried using mules, pulling it. I'm not too sure how he did this, but he had mules on shore pulling the ferry across. But they were pretty, as mules are, they were pretty cantankerous, and they kept fighting, and they'd break the rope, and then the ferry would float down the lake, and they'd have to retrieve it at Celeron.
Did you pay extra for the floating down?
Well, it's not like it is today. Whenever the ferry breaks loose today, we just go get somebody with a power boat and tow it back to where it belongs. But in those days, about all they had were rowboats and canoes, and if you ever tried to row the ferry, anyhow, 1874, he established a Sunday school assembly at Chautauqua. It was called Fairpoint. Now on Sundays, people on the east side of the lake would go down to the ferry and take the ferry across, and then people that would, either friends or hired transport, would meet them and bring them up here to Chautauqua for Sunday services. One fellow by the name of Tommy Rexford, he even made special arrangements. He worked on the ferry, and he said he would accommodate them any time. Now, normally they ran from 6 a.m. until midnight, but if you probably paid extra, he would accommodate you after midnight. Of course, they didn't have to worry about boats going up and people on water skis and things like that, so there was no problems there. One thing that I just found out, and I enjoy telling about, is on August 14th, a humble little U.S. mailboat called the Josie Bell became the most important ship in the world, actually. She transported a very important VIP from Jamestown to Chautauqua. This was on a Saturday, by the way. At least according to that thing that Ludwig gave me some time ago. But, of course, as soon as the big steamers, boats found out about this, all the owners were at each other's throat about who was going to transport this VIP. The people that were in charge decided they had enough of that, so they took their own boat, the little Josie Bell, the little mailboat, smaller than the Chautauqua Bell, just a little tug, little thing. They decked it all out with evergreens and flags and ribbons and flowers, and she proudly sailed up the lake carrying President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, the only reason I like to include this is because I can imagine what went on the lake, on all sides of the lake, as they steamed up through there. Certainly at the Narrows, both at Bemus Point and at Stowe, there were great crowds of people gathered waving flags. As I said, a steel cable replaced the... Oh, there have been talks about bridges forever. In 1902, Bemus Point business leaders, including Dr. J.J. Lenhart, heard a report on a proposed bridge. They established a committee to study it. I never heard of it again. In 1923, another proposal was made. Very lot of noise about it, but it never even made it to committee. And in 51 and 59, there was more talk and plans and resulted in no action. Now, this 1902 bridge was going to be one of two types. It was either going to be an inclined bridge that passed over the lake at about 50 feet in the center, so sailboats and the steamers could get through, or it was going to be a drawbridge in the center. At any rate, it was going to be 28 feet wide, 18 feet for vehicular traffic, and 10 feet for pedestrians. So what do we have today? We got a big monster with 2 lanes going east, 2 lanes going west, but you can't walk on it. Unless you want to cut the locks that keep you off of the catwalks underneath. You can do that. In 1902, finally, Alton Ball installed the first naphtha-fired steam engine. I don't know how many of you remember naphtha, but it's a petroleum derivative. And then in 08, he replaced it with a single-cylinder gasoline engine, and all these things reduced the time crossing. Things like seashells, tin horns, air horns, electric bells, and blinking your lights on your car or sounding your horn were some of the many methods used to call the ferry. Now, the ferry was docked on the Stowe side. If you came and he was on the Stowe side and you wanted him in Bemus Point, you had to, first you had to blow this conch shell, which I forgot to bring, but anyhow, and then they had this tin horn that you had to blow. And then finally they had an air horn, which everybody could blow, and then they had the electric bell, and then they didn't have that at all. 1915, Alton Ball became the keeper of the ferry, and in 1916 he replaced the single-engine cylinder with a 4-cylinder one. In 1921, and this is the first time the name Stow appears, Alton Ball incorporated the ferry as the Bemus Point-Stow Ferry Incorporated. Now, the one ferry, the ferries always had the cable on the north side because the winds would blow it down like this, and if you had the cables on the south side, that could give you big problems. So the cables were always on the north side. My wife's uncle told the story about once he transported cows across, farmer and his cows. They hardly got away from Stow, and one of the cows jumped off the ferry and started to swim alongside. So all the others jumped off the ferry and swam along with it. When he got over to Bemus Point, the farmer said he wasn't going to pay because the cows had all gone on over under their own power. Now, Uncle Dib was quite a character. And how he expected to do this, I have no idea. But he told that farmer, in no uncertain terms, if he didn't pay, he was going to put all those cows back on the ferry and take them back to Stow. How one man was going to get all those cows on the ferry, I have no idea. But anyhow, it worked, and the man paid. Also in the early days, when Dib was on this, now Dib was quite a jokester. He's one of these people. You all probably remember that butter used to come in a dish and it was mounded up and you'd pass it around. Well, if he passed you the butter, you better be careful, because if you reach for it this way, that butter would be sunk clear up to your knuckle. Anyhow, they would take everybody across on the ferry, except if there was just one or two people, they'd row them across in a rowboat. Well, this nice couple came up, and Dib said he'd row them across, and the man said that was all right with him, but she said no way was she going across, and he said, well, I won't take you across unless you go by rowboat. And so the two fellows finally convinced this lady that she should go across in the rowboat. Well, she got on all right, and she got to the other side all right, but when she went to get off, she tripped and fell and face first in about 6 inches of water. She was all dressed very fancy. The language she used, even today, might shock people. And she wasn't at all happy. Now, for a brief period in 1924, there were two ferries operating side by side, merely because they had just brought one up from Jamestown. They weren't sure how it was going to work, so they had these two ferries operating side by side. Actually, at different times, there were as many as 4 ferries operating on Chautauqua Lake. There were the two at Stow, Bemus Point, whatever you prefer. There was one from Lakewood to Greenhurst, and there was one from Celeron to Flavanna. There was also a 5th one, and it was up in Cassadaga Lake. In the late 1890s, it transferred people from Cassadaga over to Lilydale. In 1928, Alton Ball had a steel hull that really is the basis of the steel hull we have now, built in Jamestown by Graves. It was 65 feet long, 22 feet wide, and weighed 60 tons. And that's about, basically it's the one we have now. Alton Ball died in 1942. His son ran it for that year, but the next spring in '43, the ferry was sunk. It was sitting on the Stow side, but it was sitting on the bottom. Now, a lot of people say Gerald did it. Probably he did. Well, he did not, the war was on, and he could go to Erie, Pennsylvania and get himself a good paying job in one of the war industries. And he didn't want to be stuck with that ferry collecting nickels, dimes, and quarters, so it was sunk. Bruce Chilson, if any of you remember him. Bruce Chilson was the highway superintendent in Chautauqua County at that time, and in a very flowery, wordy speech, he convinced the legislature to buy it. So they bought it for 15 grand. Then they spent another 20 grand refurbishing it, but they operated it from that time until 1982. How much time do we take?
Lots of time.
Okay. There's, well, at the time they bought it, it had the engine in the center. It operated with two cables guiding it and another cable pulling it. These cables that pulled it, it was an interesting mechanism. They had a big wheel. They used this on the manila rope too. Had a big wheel, and they would pass the cable or the rope over the big wheel, and it would be held in place by guides or rollers at each end. And then they'd have a crank geared in, and they would crank it by hand, and the wheel would travel along the cable, and of course the ferry would follow along with it. It was quite an arduous task. They had extra grippers that were kind of looked like pipe wrenches that the people could grab the cable and help him move it along. The kids liked to do that, and they liked to have the kids ride on the ferry, and they would let them ride for free. But when the first engine was in the center, and it had this, but it was driving this this mechanism, and the cables on either side. The county changed it. They moved the engine over to the side, like it is now, on an outrigger, and they removed the drive cable, and they put the paddle wheels on there, so she was self-propelled. And that's the way she's been ever since. That was probably about 46, 45, somewhere in there. So they, incidentally, Alton Ball, when he died, his obituary said that he had operated that ferry for 42 years, and there was probably not another person in Chautauqua County that was so well acquainted with everybody in Chautauqua County as he was. So for the next 40 years, it was considered part of the county highway system. The first 3 years, it made a total of $6,000 profit. But from then on, it lost anywhere from $10,000 to $60,000 a year. But it was part of the highway system. So our tax dollars took care of it, just as our tax dollars take care of the roads. And the fares were 5 cents for, you probably remember these, the fares were 5 cents for pedestrians, 15 cents for motorcycle, 25 cents for a car, 35 to 100 cents for a truck, depending on the size. A big semi could travel over for $1, and 10 cents for livestock. However, we didn't have much in the way of livestock. On the Stowe side, we had a lot of adventures with the ferry. One time in the early 1960s, my boys and I returned from Camp Mers on a Saturday, and we found Stowe was in a big uproar. There were cars lined up and we had 2 or 3 gas stations. All the gas stations were full of cars, and all the fathers in Stowe were fixing their kids' bicycles. Everybody had flat tires. Well, it turns out that the county decided to save money. Every 3 years, they replaced one of the cables, alternating from side to side. Now, when they replaced the cable, they'd pull it out a little ways to the end of their property, then cut it off, and then cut it up, put it on a truck, then they pulled some more out, cut it off. Well, they decided they would save time. They just take the cable, pull it up the ferry road, across 17J, and up in front of the, almost in front of the senior citizens building. Worked like a charm. They cut it, when they got it all up there, they cut it up, and boy, they were, everything was great. There was only one little problem. Little tiny needles, about so long, sharp on both ends, some with little barbs on them, came off of that cable all the way up through there. Well, what were they going to do? So they called the fire department. Fire department hosed them all off into the grass. Well, that's fine. Now the only ones that'll be damaged are the kids running around in their bare feet. So I grabbed a magnet. I had a big, powerful magnet, and I grabbed it, and I filled the bottom of a bucket about 3 inches with them. And I decided I wasn't going to be able to do that job, so I called the county. They said they were taking care of it. They rented a big electromagnet and went up and down the streets until finally they got practically all of them. You can imagine what the cost was on that for the little bit they saved. From then on, why they cut it up down at the ferry. They were sure. There were 3 boys that were traveling on the ferry one day. They went across to Bemus Point, had a good time, and on the way back, when they got ready to pay their nickel, one of them dropped his nickel and it rolled off into a crack. The operator didn't see this, so he didn't believe him, and he didn't know what to do, and at first he was going to keep one of them hostage, and they all volunteered because they wanted to ride back and forth on the ferry. He decided that wasn't a good idea. So he let them go with the promise that they would bring the nickel back. But he wanted to know their names. Well, my son, Danny Thomas, one of Jim Fisher's boys, Eddie Fisher, and one of the Tracys from up around Mayville, Dick Tracy.
Excuse me a second. You all appreciate those names. I tell that story to people who are younger, and they all look at me like the only one they might know is Dick Tracy.
Of course, when there were rumors about the bridge way back in the 50s, but everybody kind of poo-pooed it, figured no, they weren't going to build it. Besides, everybody figured they're going to build a bridge, they're going to build it right to Narrows. Well, the state, in examining, found that at the Narrows, the bottom is too soft, and the pilings would have to go down as much as 150 feet into the lake. But down where they finally build it, the soft stops about 50 feet down, and then it becomes there's a hard granular material. So that's where they build it. But of course, when we first found out where they were going to build it, everybody says, they're going to build a ferry. Where? Oh, there was a lot of controversy. They started or they're going to build a bridge. They started the bridge in 73. The environmentalists stopped it in 74. They had to pull 4 or 5 pilings out because they didn't think they'd stand the ice by themselves. Finally got started again in '77, and then they worked on it for fairly well, and it was finally dedicated with a much fanfare in '82. Well, what's going to happen to the ferry? Well, the Sea Lion Group took over, and with a little bit of fanfare and banging of a cannon, why, they took over the ferry at that time. And as I said, they've run it ever since. They've had good times, bad times. I was a volunteer for several years, and in fact, I was in charge of it for several years. I think it was '83. We had the Chautauqua Ferry. I don't know. Does anybody remember the Chautauqua Ferry? Oh, that was sponsored by the Genesee Beer Company, and you got 50 people on each side, and whoever can pull the ferry to their side or get it going to their side, they get all the beer they can drink. So they had the fellow that did the rigging for the Sea Lion. He attached a big 2-inch rope to each of the bumpers on either end. And on the outer ends of these ropes, he had spliced in a 1-inch rope that people could get a hold of. So they attached them, and I took the ferry out, and where I thought was the middle, I knew I had checked it before, and I had marked an X on the side, so I knew that was the middle. Well, that's it. I had to do all my weddings in the middle too. But anyhow, of course, they knew I was in the middle because they had the ropes, and when the time came, why, the cannon boomed, and these people started pulling. Now on the Stow side, most of the 50, well, not most, but a good 20% of the 50 were the Stow people. Now, I don't know if any of you know the Stow people, but one of them, he'd have to stoop a little bit to come in through that door. They are big people. There were the Stow people, and I don't know who was on the other side. The ferry actually shuddered. It was like you could feel it vibrate just a little bit. And then the bumper on the Stow side popped a weld, and I thought it was going to tear loose, but it finally held, and finally it started moving to the Stow side. So Stow won, and Frank Stow tells me he never did get any beer, but that was all right. They had the fun of winning. We had one the next year, '84. Same thing happened, except this time we had tied, the rope was fastened to itself in the center, and then there were smaller ropes that held it down to the ferry or to the bumpers on each side, so that they weren't actually pulling on the ferry, they were pulling on this rope. All of a sudden, the rope on the Stow side went slack, and so Bemus Point won. The only problem was this small rope had broken loose from the big one, and there was a little lady at the end of the 50 people, and everybody piled up on her, and they hauled her off to the hospital. She wasn't hurt real bad, but it could have been disastrous. Another great sight that I remember was in '85, it had, no, 83, 85, yeah. I was captain on the ferry, and we heard that the Sea Lion was going to come down. And here they came, around the point, and they were leaning at an angle like that. We thought that they did it on purpose. Actually, they had kind of lost control of it, and until they got the canvas under control, they were afraid they were going to tip it over. I talked to Scott Deering the other day, And he was one of the gun crew, and he said at that time they didn't have any ballast in it. So he says, we took it back to Mayville, and Ernie got busy figuring it all out, and they put a bunch of rocks in the bottom to give it some ballast. From then on, it worked pretty good. Of course, I think you all have seen it come up the lake and go to berth in Ferry, or in Mayville. The first time it did that, oh, there were boats all over the place. There must have been 200 boats out there blowing their horns and going along. They didn't last a long point. The ferry travels roughly about 4 miles an hour. That isn't even trolling speed. And people just got bored. By the time it came up through Chautauqua, there wasn't anybody. It's been kind of touch and go with the ferry ever since. One year it sunk in the ice, but they got it out. The person that's most responsible, of course it's a Sea Lion group, but the person that's most responsible for saving that ferry, and he's got it going in good shape now, in fact it sits down there and everything's fine, is John Cheney, if any of you know him. So, now there's a lot more to the story. So far I got over 100 pages and I'm still gathering in information. There's all kinds of little stories about the ferry. And, like one of Jean's grandmothers used to play the organ over at Bemus Point in the small Methodist church. And of course she had to get across. Well, in the summertime she could either row herself across or she could ride the ferry if it was going across. That was no problem. But then when the ice started to settle in, she wouldn't dare cross on the ice, so unless somebody would take her around by buggy, and that was a long trip around through Mayville, why she just couldn't make it. Then when the winter set in real good, why she'd walk across or drive a buggy across the ice. Wow. They drove back and forth across that ice. Jean's mother tells a story about one time her father was driving the family over to Bemus Point in a wagon. They almost got to Bemus Point and the wagon dropped through the ice when it got to the edge of the... Fortunately, the horses were out in shallower water and they pulled them all out. They went back by way of Mayville. Well, in springtime, it gets pretty treacherous out there. It starts to melt away from them. I could tell you more, but that's... Why don't we see if we have any questions?
That was terrific.
If you want to have a seat, we'll ask questions of anybody here. And then I'm going to ask a little bit, we're going to flip completely. You were going to talk to you about your judicial career.
By what?
Your judicial career. You're as a judge.
What about it?
Well, let's stay on the ferry here for a while.
I did it for 44 years.
I'm anxious.
And if you're a town justice, you can work until they carry you out feet first. It doesn't matter what your age is. If you're a Supreme Court judge, you can keep on going until they carry you out feet first. Doesn't matter what your age is. All the judges in between, they have to retire at 70. Now, I haven't been able to figure out what that's all about. I mean, are the ones in between incompetent when they get over 70?
But don't ask this crowd.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Well, if 70 is the new 50.
Yeah.
Questions on the ferry?
I just wanted to say this week on Channel 5, they have the Sea Lion, getting it from Lake Erie to where it is now in Barcelona. They
Oh,
have
you
the
mean
film on.
the raising of the sea lion?
Right.
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
that.
it's on.
I think what they presented, I copied on tape, and I have it at home.
Well, they're showing it every night.
Are they?
I think it's at 8 o'clock or
Yeah.
9 o'clock around there.
Yeah, Gene and I went over when they pulled her in over at Barcelona. That was quite a sight. Poor old thing, she's real bad shape. Yeah,
At one time, the ferry was pulled out of the water on rails every fall, on the Stowe side.
Yes.
I recall. When did they stop doing that, and why did they stop doing it?
the rails rusted and decayed to the point where they couldn't get it out there anymore. I think it was 73, and they took it down to Mayville. They had the little toot. Remember the little toot? Salmonson's tug. They had the little toot take it down to Mayville, and they put it in the, it was in the, what do you call that? The boat landing. It turned out to be almost a disastrous idea. The vandals tore everything off of it until it was right level with the deck. They even built fires on the decks to keep themselves warm. It was a real mess when they got it back to Stowe. So they never did that again. From then on, they used to keep it up at Stowe, but they'd pull the paddle wheels out and set them up on shore so they wouldn't get damaged by the ice. Actually, now they leave the whole thing in the ice, and the ice doesn't damage even the paddle wheels. It just doesn't build up right around there. There must be a spring in the area or something that keeps it. And not that it's open water, but it must keep it fairly thin around there.
I recall also that for a long time, the paddle wheels were chain driven, but now it's hydraulic pumps and hydraulic motors, I believe.
Well-
When did they change that?
Yeah, pardon?
When did they change over to hydraulics?
When we took it over in '82, it was driven by hydraulics, I think. Yeah. It must have been shortly before that. You're now in an area where I haven't had a chance to go yet. I'll have to get those dates, but it was shortly before the Sea Lion group took over. Yeah, it had a 6-cylinder Chevy engine. Then I think it had a Pontiac engine, and it used a cone drive so that it could start up slowly and so that they could reverse it. A rather unique cone drive that I've been working with mechanics most of my life, and I had never seen another one like it, but it worked. Yeah.
I saw the letter on your charts objecting to the bridge and saying that there was another way to go, that they could have taken 17 through Westfield, and that it was not true that the 17 would bring a lot of economic benefit to the area. What do you think? Did the bridge do any good for?
Bring
Chautauqua
a
County?
benefit to the area? Well, Stowe itself is starting to mushroom. Somebody wanted to build a 10-story hotel down there.
Yeah, I saw that.
I think he's run into economic problems right now.
Yeah.
But Stowe hasn't started to develop yet, but it will. As soon as we get sewers, then things will start to pick up. We don't have sewers, we don't have water. For a long time, we have gas now. We didn't have gas. And then the cruelest of blows for a long time was we didn't even have cable.
That is primitive.
Yeah, we have cable. In fact, our houses, Nancy's house and mine, we're on the southern end of whatever you have up here, the Westfield end of it.
What is the reason for the cul-de-sac in front of your house?
Oh, that's Bob Pickett. Well, okay. In front of my house is the old road. I mean, like 1800s. That's the old road that went through Stowe.
So where the bridge is, that road would have gone through in the 1800s?
In front of my house. Yeah, that was the only road. And I think in 1937, they shortened up the curve there. They took the curve out, and that's what became 17J. Now, when the bridge went in, we had these two roads here connected by a bridge, and there was, they connected them up at the end so that you could drive in around there. But the Ball Creek didn't like the bridge, so it tumbled it in. And so that was the end of that 17J part of it. Bob Pickett just built that cul-de-sac so the snowplows, see that even though there's only two houses there, they have to keep the snow plowed, and so that the snowplows could get around.
Judge, I've always been curious as the 17, the 17J, and up until recently, there was actually signs at various points as you were traveling around. And I don't recall now if they were numbers or they were.
Yeah, they were.
What was that for?
That was so you could tell how far you were from Jamestown or Mayville.
Yeah, they had zones.
The zones?
So you could identify where you were.
Yeah.
If you were zone 8, well, they knew where you were.
So that was for postal services? Or
No,
just-
that was for us. That was for the people.
So zone 8 or,
I think those numbers begin at 0 at the state line
okay.
and go up, going east on those signs.
But there was this thing right around the lake. I mean, you had this sort of signage.
Yeah, these were just around the lake.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ones you're thinking of are on I-86, and they start
Yeah.
those mileage markers. Now they have a mileage marker every 2/10 of a mile.
I believe those zones started in Jamestown or in Lakewood, and as you went toward Mayville, they were spaced a mile apart.
Right, I think they were set up originally by the Chautauqua Lake Association,
That could be.
one of their earlier projects.
Yeah.
When the bridge was built and, or the location was decided, they tore down the Watson mansion, the estate there.
They tore down the main mansion.
Right, and there wasn't, did they lose any other property other than the Watson estate?
The carriage house and the guest house are there.
Right.
They're owned by a family from Cleveland by name of Camilla, and they have fixed it up real nice.
Are those the red tile roof ones?
Yeah. But did they lose any other property other than the main house for the Watson estate?
Yes, they had some man-made caves that they lost.
Well, I know, but no other property.
Oh, yes, right through, well, next door to me, to my father, there used to be a farm that, then was turned into a girls' camp. That is no longer there. The Saxton zoned a farm, they moved them out. I mean, all along where I-86 now is, were farms. And they moved those families out to wherever. They paid them cheap prices and moved them out. And I mean, my mother, Dad's 86, my mother grew up in the house that I live in, and she was 81, she'd be 84 now. And all of her life, she grew up in that area, and many farms, many families moved. The state.
Yours just barely made it.
Mine just barely made it. The state decided that they were gonna put the I-86 and the bridge through, and on both sides of the lake, they moved it out. So,
They went right through one of the better fields for Indian artifacts that we have in Stowe. Not the best. The best one is at Tom's Point. Another one is across the creek from our house, but there was a good one up at the Saxton place. And a lot of things that you can't do, the DOT can do without batting an eyelid. Yeah,
Do we know what the final cost of the bridge was?
wasn't it 51 million? Yeah. Now, the press said that the bridge was only going to cost 1.6 million. Well, the bridge they were talking about was this one they proposed in 1901. Talk about your biased press, you know. They want to make it look real bad. Actually, I think the bridge was supposed to start out at about 16 million and finally ended up at 51 or thereabouts. Of course, 16 million for a bridge like that, that's a ridiculous price anyhow.
can I just add something too? Someone asked how the people that are proponents of the ferry feel about the bridge. Well, Mom and Dad were two people that protested the bridge and were very happy when the environmentalists said that it wasn't going through. Then it went through, and in October 28th of 1982, when the bridge opened, Mom and Dad were some of the first two people from Stowe to meet people from Bemus halfway. You know, there's mixed emotions. It takes 8 minutes from my house to Jamestown, where it used to take 20. We don't like seeing it. We don't like the traffic in our side yard.
It's noisy.
Yeah, but the convenience of getting on that, getting right onto it, you know. So it's like everything in this world. You lose a lot, you gain a lot. You have to live with what you've got. So I think
I was
think
one
we
of those
just go with it.
protesters too.
There were a
I
lot of
wasn't
people
living
that
here
said
in
the
that-
ferry
during
would not
that area,
survive the
but
bridge,
era, but
would
Mom
not
and
need
Dad
the
were-
ferry any longer after the bridge was open.
Yeah.
I can tell you, as one of the members of the old Sea Lion crew that has taken over, we had a big debt to pay off, but we paid off that debt. We have changed some things. John Cheney has done a lot for it. He started an idea here 2 summers ago. Instead of charging a fee, you make contributions, and is actually in the black.
Works out better, yeah. We take in more money that way.
Organization, we have a good financial organization, and we think that this thing might go for another 200 years. But
Well, it's got to go until 2011, then it'll be 200 years old. And I forgot to mention, Sally Carlson, our town supervisor, got busy, and a whole bunch of us signed a petition. We petitioned the post office to issue a stamp in the 2011 for the ferry. Don't know whether it'll work. Now, about the bridge being stopped, the fellow that was in charge of that said that our ecology, nature was going to be damaged by the bridge and I-86. He was right. The little creek alongside our house, you could stand on our bridge anytime and look down, and pretty soon you'd see minnows swimming around. And you'd see crawdads going around. This last summer, I stood on the bridge for ages, and I never saw anything down there. And there's some kind of a silt on everything, a brown silt. I asked the Bemus Point people, what does Bemus Creek look like? It looks the same way. The runoff from I-86, the runoff from any road, they use salt. I mean, we all want to get where we want to go. We don't want to have our cars slipping and sliding around. So they use salt. And that damages everything. That's very damaging. Even in the summertime, you got road dust, which consists of rubber tires and all kinds of chemicals and exhaust fumes and everything. And that's running down into the creeks. He said that it would kill things starting with the small plants and animals, and then gradually work its way up through. But we all got to have our cars. We all got to get someplace, and they haven't figured out how to drive them without gasoline yet.
Do you need?
Yes.
You have to take a course, it's a short course, and then get a license, and yes, there's room for some more volunteers.
Yeah. Get a hold of John Cheney if you want to. He's in the phone book.
It's fun. I wasn't a pilot. Dad was a pilot, but I've worked the ferry, and it's fun. Unless you're in a thunderstorm.
Well, how many of you know Norm Skillman? I have to tell you about Norm Skillman. Do you know Norm Skillman? Anybody know Norm Skillman? He's quite a character at Bemus. Very wonderful person. He was one of my best volunteers. I could always rely on Norman. And he told this story on himself. I didn't observe it. But one time, he got to talking to a few young ladies and not paying attention to what was going on. And the first thing he knows, the pilings on Bemus Point side are going by the ferry. He's about from here to the bookcase from the Bemus Point. He throws it into reverse. He yelled at everybody to brace himself. He threw it into reverse. He claims he bounced off of the ferry pilings halfway back, about 20 or 30 feet back out into the lake. I think he's exaggerating a little bit, but it must have been quite a shock, because you got 60 tons plus whatever is on top of the ferry going down through there, and it's not an easy thing to start. In fact, one of the operators, one time, some smart jerk in a motorboat figured he could get across in front of the ferry just as it was coming into the Bemus Point dock, and it got trapped between the cables, and it was a mad scramble to get the ferry in reverse, because if it had driven that boat up against it would have crushed it.
Tell us about the book. Where are you in the writing of it, and is there a scheduled time of that?
I'm going through the pangs of being thoroughly confused about now. I have so much information, I don't know how to sort it out, and I know there's more information out there I've got to get, and I've got about 5 chapters done. There'll be about 10 or so. The trouble is, I keep reading back through what I wrote, and then I change it.
Yeah.
And I'm not a skilled author, but I'm working on it.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Surely by 2011 for the
Pardon?
You'll have it for the 200th anniversary, I hope.
211, yeah. Oh, yeah.
2011.
Good Lord willing, the creek don't rise. Of course, I got to last that long, too.
Other questions? This has been incredible.
This was
Just terrific. Thank you so much, Judge. And there's a wonderful exhibit here for those who did not have a chance to see it as it was being set up.
Yeah, we'll leave it up for a while.